Hello, I'm Andrew Corbett, and I want to take you through a little bit of an excursion through Paul's epistles to the Corinthians. We're going to have a look at why this is considered by some scholars to be two of the most difficult epistles in the New Testament to understand. Many of Paul's epistles we can correspond to his journeys through the book of Acts. We can see that Dr. Luke, who travelled with him partway through his mission adventures, tells us when and where Paul was travelling to and from, and he dates it sometimes by mentioning people like Proconsul Gallio, who we know was in Corinth around 51 AD, and Paul's arrival there is sort of linked around that event. And we know that Paul was there for a certain time. We've got another record of that in Acts 18 and so on as we read through there. And so we can track when Paul was roughly in Corinth. We need to appreciate that Corinth is divided into two eras. There was the Greco-Corinth, then there's the Roman Corinth. And the difference is around about 146 BC or so, the then Romans came in and just destroyed the whole place. Corinth is it's kind of like a land with a land bridge back to Greece. That land bridge is called an isthmus. And the land that Corinth inhabited was known as Achaia. And so we read about this in Paul's other epistles. We read about this in Luke's telling of Acts. And so Corinth was a part of Achaia. And in fact, Corinth was at the foot of Mount Corinth. Now, in 146 or so BC, this place was known for its immorality and debauchery. It was an insult to be called a Corinthian because it meant that you were essentially without morals. And so the Romans destroyed it. Not until around about 46 or so BC, so roughly 100 years later, Julius Caesar came along and he decided to re-establish Achaia with Corinth as its capital, and he saw this as a way to reward his men, and he allotted to many of his soldiers portions of land in Corinth. And so we had the second era of Corinth beginning, essentially known as Roman Corinth. And so when we meet Paul, we're meeting Paul in Corinth around about 51 AD. Then we have his epistle, and we can roughly date this epistle, 1 Corinthians, to somewhere around 53, 54, maybe 55, but somewhere in that era. And again, we've got good landmarks, I suppose, historical landmarks for doing that. Corinth is, for us today, is a really important epistle. The issues that Paul talks about to the Corinthians, some of these issues they asked him about. They wrote to him and they said, we need to understand this. Then the people who actually delivered that letter to Paul when Paul was probably in Ephesus, which was across the sea where he was, probably said, oh, and Paul, there's something else you need to know. And so they reported to him certain things. So through 1 Corinthians, Paul says things like, it has been reported to me. And we track through this exchange that Paul says, now regarding what you wrote. And then he'll say in chapter 7, now regarding virgins. So that tells us they've written to him. They've made the inquiry. They want to know about these things. But then there's some things they didn't ask him about, but he wants them to know. So we see in 1 Corinthians these issues. The issues that Paul needs to address here come down to probably some curious things. Firstly, Corinth was a particularly spiritual place. These people in Corinth had a very strong awareness of the supernatural. We know that because of the questions that they have. They also had a misunderstanding about grace, a misunderstanding about what it meant to be forgiven, what it meant to live as a Christian. And Paul is going to address that misunderstanding. And it's actually going to cause some heartache, which we'll see in a moment. 1 Corinthians also says, Paul says to them, in the previous letter that I wrote to you. So we know 1 Corinthians is actually not the first epistle that Paul wrote to the Corinthians. It's at least his second epistle. Interestingly, as we get into 2 Corinthians, we're going to see that between 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians, there was another letter that Paul wrote, and he had to address this issue of disunity, but now the disunity had become animosity toward Paul. So we're dealing with a church that we can see had lots of problems. And we ought to thank God that they did, because we wouldn't have the beauty and the treasure of God's word that we now have contained in these two epistles if they didn't have these problems that Paul had to address. So, some of the other issues. There are some sexual issues, which we'll see. Corinth was a very sexual city. We have at the top of the Mount Corinth, the Acropolis there, where there was a temple to Aphrodite, and it's reported that there were many, up to 1,000 temple prostitutes. This is where meat was slaughtered and butchered. The meat sold in the marketplace was probably butchered in that temple by the temple priests. There's all sorts of questions over, should you be eating meat that's been sacrificed to demon idols? And they raise that question. Paul addresses that question. And these have some really interesting implications for us today. Paul then addresses their misuse of the spiritual gifts, the gifts of speaking in tongues, of prophecy, of discernment, words of knowledge, miracles, healings, and so on. And that's really helpful to us today as well. He certainly doesn't say these things are only a temporary thing and they're going to pass away in their lifetime. He doesn't say that at all. So we're going to see that this is really important. We're also going to see, as we get into 2 Corinthians, how Paul dealt with incredible and fierce opposition to his own ministry, his own apostolic ministry. He coins the term super apostles, and in 1 Corinthians he uses it in one way, and in 2 Corinthians he alludes to it in quite a different way. So this is why I think looking at 1 and 2 Corinthians is really important, because today we also as the church need to understand God's will for us as a church. Paul wanted the Corinthians to be considerate of each other, to operate as a family, brothers and sisters, but not just that. A family that understood discipline, a family that understood that leaders had to intervene. And he refers to this without actually specifying what their leadership structure was. So this should cause those people who get perhaps curious about whether you should have a congregational government, or a priest or a pastor, or a designated leader. All of these things seem from 1 and 2 Corinthians to be way down secondary compared to the fact that what these people, whoever they are, however many there are supposed to do. These are some of the issues that I want to look at over the next few videos as we delve deeper into Paul's epistles to the Corinthians.